Questions referring to the domain of a function are not very popular with students because they're a little bit icky, they're a little bit tricky, and students are not always sure what the question's asking or what they're really looking for. But essentially, every function has got a domain, and the domain are the values you're allowed to put into the function without there being some kind of problem. The opposite of that are the restrictions on the domain. The values, if you do put them into the function, are going to cause some kind of issue. There are only two potential issues with the domain of the types of functions you're going to see. One is dividing by zero, because you can't divide by zero. That's not an operation you can perform. The other is square rooting a negative number, which is another operation that you can't perform. So those are the only two possible scenarios that can really have an impact on the domain. So keep that in mind first of all as you're doing a domain question. Of the two, the dividing by zero is the more common scenario. So let's say you got this function here and the question said, what values cannot be in the domain? Or what values, or what are the restrictions on the domain? Like, what are the values that are going to cause a problem? Well, there's no square root in this question, so the square root issue cannot be part of the problem. The only problem could be if the denominator was zero. So you're trying to find the x values and make that denominator zero. Now, most students will look at this and they'll start trying to guess values or guesstimate values or work it out in their heads. You can get there eventually, but you probably wouldn't even get the marks for that anyway, or you might get possibly 1 mark. But an easier way to do it is just say, well, if I want to find the values that make that zero, let me just take that denominator, which is quite often a trinomial, like this one, set it equal to zero. If I set it equal to zero and solve that quadratic equation, those are the values that will give me zero. So this is the formal way to do it. Set it equal to zero. Because it's a quadratic equation, we need to factorize it. This one would factorize like this. And then you're going to get solutions for the equation of x equals 4 and x equals 3. So to answer the question, what values cannot be in the domain? What are the restrictions on the domain? These two values. In other words, if you put 4 in there for x, the denominator will be 0. If you put 3 in there for x, the denominator will be 0. So that's how you would find the restrictions in that case. In this case here, slightly different because, well, first of all, we're dealing with the square root. Secondly, we are also dealing with the fraction issue, but just dealing with the square root first of all. So let's think about the values that would cause a problem here. So if x was 4, 4 take away 4 is 0, you can square root 0. You get the square root of 0 to be 0, so that part's okay. But in terms of the square root part, any number that is smaller than 4, like let's say for example that x was 3, then 3 take away 4 is minus 1, then you'd be square rooting a negative. But even if x was say 3.9, then you're still going to have a problem because you would get a negative when you subtract 4 from that. In fact, if x is any value smaller than, if x is smaller than 4, you're going to get an issue because you're going to be trying to square root a negative. If x is 4, like I said earlier, the square root part's okay. The square root of 0 is 0, so you can process that square root, but then you would be dividing by 0. So that means that the problem parts of this function, the parts that cannot be in the domain, the restrictions, are where x is smaller than 4, or in this case, equal to 4. They're both going to cause a problem for different reasons. One, for square rooting a negative, and secondly, for dividing by 0. Domain questions can be difficult to navigate, but I would say in most cases, look out for the dividing by 0. It does tend to be the predominant feature, and look out for the bottom, the denominator being a quadratic, particularly a trinomial, but could be a binomial, but something you've got to factorize and then solve. Those will be the restrictions on the domain.